Hi, everybody. We want to say a big welcome to all of you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Kids Count in Colorado web release for the 2021 report. Just a couple of housekeeping tasks before we jump into the report. If you could make sure that you're on mute and that you stay on mute, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please save any of your questions for the end. And also we are recording the webinar. You probably got that notification when you came into the room. So just so you're aware of that. So again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Erica Manawato. I'm the Manager of Research Initiatives at the Colorado Children's Campaign. And today we're so glad to have you all with us to talk through some of the most pressing child and family well-being data that we looked at in this report. A quick note on the report, the overarching sort of theme throughout our report is this idea of looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and acknowledging that the pandemic has disrupted and upended essentially every aspect of our lives and our children's lives. And also that many of us have sort of pined for getting back to normal. But we also recognize that in our normal state in Colorado before the pandemic, we were failing a lot of kids as well. We saw about 135,000 kids who were experiencing poverty, 73,000 who went without health insurance. We saw 80 teens and 20 children in our state who died or lost their lives to suicide in a single year. And we also saw unjust policies and practices that created circumstances where a child's race too often predicted their opportunities to see a healthcare provider, to attend a well-resourced school, or to participate in a preschool program. And so a question that we ask in the report is, what if getting back to normal wasn't the goal after the COVID crisis? What if we come together, acknowledge the crisis that we all have lived through and dealt with, but also imagined systems and rebuilding them in a way that ensures that all children have what they need to thrive in our state. Just some quick background on the report. If you're new to the report, the Kids Count in Colorado report is part of the Annie E. Casey Foundation's National Kids Count Project. It tracks child well-being at the state and county levels. And the intent of the report is to provide decision makers like you all and child advocates with quality, non-biased information about the status of children and families. It's also generously funded by the foundations that you see at the bottom of the screen who make it possible for us to do this report every year. And a quick acknowledgement and dedication before we jump in. So you'll notice many of you know and love Sarah Hughes, our Vice President of Research Initiatives. She is unable to be here today. She is dealing with a family emergency and we have her in our thoughts, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned her. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Sarah leads the vision, the writing, and the publishing of this report every year. We write it together. We usually give this presentation together, so I'm going to be missing her a lot in the presentation. But I was really inspired by how she tackled this report this year and thought about how can we showcase our current reality, but also push ourselves to think critically about opportunities in the years ahead and to be hopeful around those opportunities. So she will be missed today. Finally, the 2021 report is dedicated to the children and youth of Colorado. We know that our kids have made these immense sacrifices during the pandemic. Many of them lost loved ones to COVID. Others missed meals. They lost the roof over their heads. And many just missed out too on the simple joy, everyday joys of childhood for more than a year. We believe that we owe it to Colorado kids to ensure that they have everything they need to move forward from the pandemic by passing smart and innovative public policies that prioritize their well-being in the months and years to come. And we hope that you all will join us in that effort as well. So we're going to jump into the first section of the report that we'll cover today is our Family Economic Security section where we look at data around how families are doing in terms of their finances, because we know that is predictive of so many pieces of child well-being. Before the pandemic, we saw in Colorado, the child poverty rate had actually fallen to its lowest level in the last 2 decades. So the data that you're going to see appear on the chart, the dark purple line is the United States child poverty rate, and in light green is Colorado. Over the last 2 decades, the child poverty rate in our state has fluctuated definitely with events like the Great Recession, but the rate consistently stayed below the national average. And in 2019, it fell to 11%. That represents about 135,000 children living in poverty. So that was some good news. We were seeing progress on that front. We do like to say whenever we present this number that 11% just recognizes the children and families living at 100% the federal poverty level and below. The federal poverty level for a family of 4 in 2019 was just $25,750 for the entire family. That figure is based on a sort of outdated formula that doesn't take into account the high cost of housing and other pieces that require quite a bit of investments from families. And so while we had fallen to 11%, which was definitely good news, at the same time, we continued to talk about how this represents kids who are living in poverty. And there are also kids just above, with families making just above this cutoff, who are still struggling mightily to afford everyday expenses. And so in 2020, we don't have the child poverty rate for Colorado yet. That's due to regular data lags for all of our indicators. Many of them take a year or more for the data to be collected and then for it to be cleaned and to be made available to the public. So while we don't have a rate for 2020, we can look at other indicators to tell us how did families fare during the pandemic time period and what likely happened to child poverty during this time. One of those indicators that we look at is the unemployment rate for the state. So the line you see now is the unemployment rate in Colorado for all of 2020. And what you see is that between February and April, the onset of the pandemic, the unemployment rate quadrupled in our state. That was the highest spike we saw that in the full year. And it fell from there and stabilized sort of towards the end of the summer and into the fall. But it was still at 7% throughout the rest of the year, much higher than we had seen in sort of pre-pandemic years. The mass layoffs in the early weeks of the pandemic propelled the share of Colorado kids with an unemployed parent to a 50-year high. So again, while we don't know the child poverty rate yet, we have a few indicators that tell us that child poverty was likely exacerbated, and unemployment is one of them. We also look at unemployment across different counties and regions in the state to see where families might have been hit the hardest. And what we found is that Colorado counties where tourism and hospitality are central to the economy saw some of the largest increases in the unemployment rate. So the 2 time periods you're going to see on this chart, and we highlighted the 5 counties where we saw the largest increase in the unemployment rate. The 2 timelines are January 2020 and January 2021. So here's those 5 counties. These are their unemployment rates at the beginning of 2020. And here are their rates at the beginning of 2021. And this doesn't even represent the spike that we saw sort of around when the pandemic hit, just sort of the beginning of each year. This is where we saw it happen most dramatically, but we also saw it in every county in the state. When we look at 2021 figures for unemployment, or January 2021 figures, it's apparent that the unemployment rate is higher in every county in the state compared to January 2020. So we know that likely impacted families as well. We also look at this year in the report data from the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey. This was a survey that was deployed to collect data from Americans during the pandemic in real time and to turn out stats quickly. So we were able to look at sort of these experimental figures on what was happening to Colorado families during the time period without those indicators that take a couple years to come out. And what we saw with economic data is that their widespread economic hardship was seen among Colorado's households with children. So about half of our households with children reported a loss of household income from when the pandemic began. We saw about a third who reported having difficulty paying for usual household expenses. That's including food and essential things like medical care. And we also know that the pandemic exacerbated the affordable housing struggles that many of our communities were already experiencing. So the Pulse survey data showed that as many as 1 in 5 of these households with children were saying that they had little to no confidence in their ability to pay their next mortgage or rent payment. We also looked at these outcomes across families by race ethnicity, because we know that families of color in our state have faced longstanding barriers to economic security. And so what you'll see on this chart are these on the bottom these are the same indicators we just talked about: loss of employment, difficulty paying usual expenses, and little or no confidence to make their next rent or mortgage payment. But these are the data or the households with children disaggregated by race ethnicity. Here's what this looked like for our white households with children. We saw about 43% losing employment income. About a quarter had difficulty paying for their expenses, and 11% struggling with their housing costs. When we look at households with children that were 2 or more races, it's higher: 49% losing employment income, 44% struggling to pay usual expenses. We don't have data on the rent or mortgage payment piece for this group because the margin of error was too large. And that goes for any other racial or ethnic group you don't see on this chart. If the margin of error was too large, we couldn't include the estimate, unfortunately. Finally, here's the data for our Hispanic or Latino households. We saw 64%, nearly 2/3 of Hispanic households with children lost employment income since the beginning of the pandemic. 44% had a hard time paying for their expenses, and 29% were not sure they were going to be able to make their next rent or mortgage payment. We are looking forward to hopefully having, higher quality data for our Black households with children, Asian households with children, American Indian, Alaska Native households with children. But for now, this is sort of what we understand, that all families were impacted financially pretty significantly by the pandemic, but especially our families of color appeared to have reported some difficulties there. So knowing all these pieces, I'm actually going to turn it over briefly to Sarah Barnes. She's our manager of special policy initiatives and does a lot of the work that we do in family economic security. She's going to talk about some of our strategies for supporting that area moving forward.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I just want to highlight a few policy strategies to support family economic security as we recover from the pandemic and beyond. The first is to provide income supports for families. And one way to do that, particularly for families who are experiencing extreme poverty, is to maximize access to the basic cash assistance payment in our TANF program and ensure that that payment is adequate to help those families meet their basic needs. We should also make sure that all families in Colorado have adequate income to afford necessities. This supports parents' ability to work and care for their kids, and it also supports the mental health of both parents and children. One strategy for doing this is by providing families with direct cash assistance. In the housing space, we should ensure that any policy solutions that support housing security in Colorado include a focus on families with children as well as youth who are experiencing homelessness, recognizing that the root causes of housing insecurity for those populations are often unique, and so policy solutions should make sure to address those root causes. And lastly, we should expand opportunities for all of our families in Colorado to build wealth. And we know that one important way to do this is through home ownership. So we should ensure that all families have the chance to buy and own a home, particularly focusing on those families who have been left out of the housing market due to discriminatory and racist policies and practices. And I will turn it back over to Erica.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And as a reminder, if you have questions that come up, especially on issue area sections, feel free to save them for the Q&A. You can also put them into the chat. I believe that we have someone monitoring the chat. So if you want to write them down there, feel free. Turning over to our child health section of the report. So we know that before the pandemic, data pointed to some troubling trends among our child and youth mental health. We know that 35% of our high school students were reporting symptoms of clinical depression, and 18% were reporting seriously considering suicide. So the teen suicide rate is an indicator that we report on every year, that we keep our eye on, because we want to understand how many young children this is tragically affecting. That line in blue is the rate for the last decade. What you see is that in recent years, our teen suicide rate had climbed to unprecedented levels. Between 2019 and 2020, we see the rate stay about the same. It increases slightly, but we don't see a spike in 2020, which, to be honest, that was a relief to me and many of my colleagues to know that we didn't see a spike in that time period, acknowledging all of the unprecedented levels of social isolation and economic hardship that were likely exacerbating people's mental health. At the same time, I want to put this rate in perspective. In 2020, we had 83 teens who lost their lives to suicide. That is still historically very high, and it is more than double what we saw in 2010, when we saw about 39 teens experience that tragic outcome. So this is something we are keeping our eye on definitely as we move forward. And while we don't have a lot of data on the mental health status of children and youth during the pandemic, we do have some on the mental health of adults. So this again comes through the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey. And these are adults who live with children. And what we saw during the pandemic is, in that blue line that you see, are the share of Colorado adults in households with children who reported really frequently feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge in the last week. You see it peaks at about 41% in the winter of 2020, and then it's still pretty high in the spring of 2021, with more than a third of adults in households with children reporting this outcome. The purple line is adults reporting feeling down, depressed, or hopeless during these time periods. Again, we see an upward trend in the winter of 2020, but then it lands on about a quarter of adults in households with children in March of 2021. And although these data reflect adults' experiences, we know that the mental health of kids and youth is really closely linked to the mental health of their caregivers, probably especially so when families are spending nearly all their time under the same roof without the typical outlets of school, work, or social activities. Pre-pandemic data on our pregnant and postpartum Coloradans also show that mental health struggles were pretty common in that population. So we know that in 2019, 12% of postpartum people in Colorado reported symptoms of depression. And then by 12 months out from giving birth, we had about a third, or 32%, who were reporting elevated symptoms of anxiety. That last chart on the right, it represents Coloradans who reported needing or wanting mental health care or counseling, but only 2/3 of them were able to get it. So just 63% were able to get it. And again, this is just before the pandemic. Before the pandemic as well, we knew that the leading causes of maternal mortality in our state were suicide and accidental overdose. So behavioral health support for pregnant and postpartum individuals has always been a significant concern for us at the campaign, just because of what we've known for the last several years. And it appears when we look at pandemic data that this was only intensified because a lot of risk factors for postpartum depression and anxiety were increased. So we have survey data from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment that tells us that half of our Colorado parents who gave birth between March 2020 and February 2021 reported their mental health had gotten worse. That's a significant portion of the people who gave birth in this time period. And their mental health had gotten worse since the pandemic began. And there were so many added stressors that this number is somewhat understandable. You know, we saw social isolation and inability to get in-person help or support from loved ones, economic hardship for families, and likely difficulty accessing postpartum care or lactation support. But this is still a very large figure for individuals who gave birth during this time period. And finally, when we look at Coloradans who gave birth during that time period, about 40% of them reported that they wanted or needed mental health care, but only half were able to actually get it. And when we look at the reasons behind this, here are the top cited barriers in this population among receiving mental health care or counseling. The most common is concern about the cost of care, which speaks to some of the economic struggles we were highlighting earlier. The second most common is that parents did not have someone to watch their children or their child to be able to do that. And that's a situation we know many parents found themselves in when childcare settings and schools closed in response to COVID-19. We're going to touch on those in the early childhood and K-12 sections as well. But we're seeing impacts from that in our health section too. So I'm actually now going to turn it over to Erin Miller. She's our Vice President of Health Initiatives to talk through some of our strategies for improving child health in the years ahead.
Thanks so much, Erica. And I think the good news is that Colorado is poised to really take advantage of policy windows to improve child health in the coming year. When we think about the youth suicide rates and the social isolation that our youth have faced over the last year, we know we need to improve access to behavioral health and social and emotional services at schools. We also know that one evidence-based way to improve school climate is through universal access to healthy school meals that improves student physical health, mental health, and family financial security because it removes that financial burden from families. Another evidence-based way to support our youth and everyone in Colorado is to invest in our evidence-based suicide prevention programs to make sure that they are serving all of the families that they can in the state of Colorado. When we think about the perinatal period and the data that folks have seen here, we know we need to ensure access to a full range of perinatal health services, including behavioral health services in the setting that works best for families. That could include group behavioral and prenatal health care that has very good outcomes for some folks. Those groups can be in clinics or virtually through telehealth. And we also know that services need to be available in the home, especially in that critical postpartum period. In those early days postpartum, folks need access to the physical and behavioral health services at their home or whatever setting works best for them. And then lastly, we know we need to ensure access to health insurance coverage for everyone in Colorado, for the 73,000 kids who went into the pandemic without health insurance coverage, and for all of our prenatal Coloradans, including those who are undocumented. Health insurance coverage is that sort of first layer to protecting the social determinants of health, allowing families to build wealth and own their own homes. Folks need to have the financial security that health insurance provides. And we know it improves mental health just to have that health insurance coverage, and it provides access to our healthcare system. So these are some of the policies that are top of mind for us as we come into this next year to improve child health. And I will turn it back over to you, Erica.
Thanks, Erin. We have two more sections we're going to dive into today, our early childhood and our K through 12 sections. We know early childhood is a time of really unmatched brain development, and kids don't get a second chance at their early childhood experience. So we'll be diving into a few indicators here. So first, before the pandemic, we know that capacity in Colorado's licensed childcare settings was not sufficient to meet the needs of all the families who likely needed care. And what that resulted in was long wait lists for care and lots of families who were put into a bind. In 2019, our rough estimate is that there were about 246,000 kids under 6 in Colorado who had all available parents in the workforce, so they were likely in need of childcare during the day. And what you're going to see on this chart is how that figure stacks up with our actual licensed childcare capacity in our state. Capacity in childcare centers, family childcare homes, and preschools only have capacity for about 62% of those children, about 152,000, leaving about 94,000 on this right-hand side of the chart of kids who their families just have to seek out other forms of care. So we know that this was limited going into the pandemic to begin with. And we also saw the COVID crisis exacerbate some of the childcare challenges for families and providers in Colorado. So our friends at Early Milestones Colorado surveyed providers during the summer of 2020, and they found that nearly 1 in 10 closed during the early months of the pandemic, and their total enrollment dropped by more than half. Their research also found that nearly 2/3 of Colorado families who were surveyed reported having to change their childcare arrangements because of the pandemic, and 1/3 reported not having childcare when they needed it when they were surveyed. Here specifically, we know the loss of childcare access during this time period particularly impacted mothers and families. So we saw between February 2020 and September of 2020, 42,000 Colorado women with children left the workforce and had largely not re-entered by October 2020. At the same time, labor force participation rates among men without kids, men with kids, and women without children increased. And so what we see is the childcare challenges impacted families, period. We know there were impacts, but it's clear that mothers were, in terms of their ability to participate in the labor force, were impacted more significantly than any other group. And that likely has effects for family economic security going back to the beginning of this presentation. We also know that nationally, parents and caregivers who lost their childcare reported much higher levels of stress and anxiety than those who had their childcare situations not changed during the pandemic. So a lot there around how access shifted significantly during this time period. Early intervention services, referrals to early intervention also dropped. So EI services, if you're unfamiliar, they serve children ages birth to 3 with delays in at least one area of development. And parents can refer their children to EI or for an evaluation themselves, but the majority of referrals come from our primary care physicians, hospitals, childcare providers, and social service providers. And we know that children were just not seeing these individuals as often, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. So what you're going to see on this chart, the line in red are the number of weekly referrals going through 2019. The line jumps around a bit because we're going week by week here. And in blue is the referrals we saw in 2020. So what you can see right off the bat is in the first 2 weeks of March 2020, as the pandemic takes hold in Colorado, we go from the week of March 1st, where there's 416 referrals, and that drops to 155 referrals the week of March 15th. That's a fall of about 63% in referrals to EI. And then for the rest of the year, generally, weekly referrals remain below their 2019 rates for the rest of 2020. We also have indications that this means that the number of children who were actually enrolled in EI services after an evaluation fell as well. We saw that fall steeply in 2020 by about 20% when we compare, January of 2021 to March of last year. This is so important because we know in the earliest years of life that weeks and months really matter. And if children are developing so quickly, and if their delays can be addressed early, interventions can be really effective. But we're wondering about all the kids who were not given referrals at this time, because we know it's not likely that they disappeared during this time, that they are there and that we just may have missed them and what those kids need as we return from this time period. EI was not the only program that saw declines in the number of children served. In 2020, we also saw fewer young children enrolling in school district-run preschools. So here is the total drop. We saw a 23% drop in the fall of 2020 compared to 2019 in terms of enrollment for preschoolers. And here's by race ethnicity. We saw some larger drops among our American Indian or Alaska Native preschool students, and then also our Asian students And for kindergarten, we also saw enrollment fall as well. We saw a 9% fall between these two time periods. And the reason we highlight these is also because we know that these children also didn't disappear, that and that they're likely to enter our K-12 system at some point, presumably in the future. Some of them might have had really enriching experiences at home, and others may have not, because their families were facing these like historic struggles every day. And so we think it's important to point out that these children will have needs moving forward when they enter into the classroom. And it's important to know where those needs fall specifically. I'm now going to turn it over to Melissa Mares. She's our Early Childhood Policy Fellow at the campaign to talk through some policy strategies for early childhood.
Thank you, Erica. Really happy to be here with you all today. Our first policy strategy is to increase support for programs that support working families' economic opportunity while also advancing children's early development. This includes high-quality childcare and preschool. We should also target funds toward areas where challenges existed before and have been significantly exacerbated by the pandemic, including early childhood workforce compensation, infant and toddler childcare, and childcare affordability. It's important that we ensure support for critical services like early intervention. The graphs you just saw really illustrate that make a tremendous impact on child development, but saw significant disruptions due to the pandemic. We also need to recognize the vital backbone role our early childhood workforce plays and make long-term sustained investments in adequate salaries for our early childhood professionals. It's critical that we invest in elementary supports, including ensuring educators have the resources and capacity to respond to a wide range of levels of school readiness, early literacy and math skills, and levels of childhood trauma so that our youngest children can recover better than before the pandemic. And finally, we support trauma-informed approaches across early childhood settings, making sure that we are supporting strategies such as expanding our early childhood mental health consultation programs. Thank you, Erica. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Our last section that we're going to dive into today is our K-12 education section. So we know that during the pandemic, the primary delivery method for public education actually changed significantly. So that's sort of at the end of school year 1920 and as well as all of school year 2021. These, again, on the screen, you're going to see household pulse survey data. And these are Colorado households with children who reported specific types of changes to how they received education. This is specifically at the end of the 1920 school year. So at this point, we had 78% of our households with children who reported their classes moved online, compared to about 15%. Their classes moved to remote learning, but they had paper materials sent home, so they didn't have to necessarily be online. 32% saw their classes canceled at some point, and so missed out on some instruction there. But I want to draw your attention to the bar on the left-hand side of the chart, the share of households where we saw the move to distance learning was online. This sort of begged the question for a lot of researchers and advocates around, well, how many kids actually have access to education online? And how do we know what resources they have available to them and who is no longer able to access the classroom? And so a report from the Colorado Future Center at CSU found that about 54,000 of our school-age children in Colorado did not have internet access. So this doesn't get to the Wi-Fi enabled devices, but just internet access at the time when public education moved online. And in a concerning finding, they showed that the majority of these children were Hispanic Latino. They were also in the elementary grades, and they were also more likely to have parents who were essential workers. So these characteristics matter because we know Hispanic Latino children, as well as other children of color in our K-12 system, have been historically underserved. And that we see that in the results, the CMAS results and graduation rates. We know that we have not served them adequately. And so to know that they were a large portion of the kids locked out of classrooms is concerning. It's also concerning because the elementary grades are the time where kids are learning really foundational skills that take quite a bit of support in learning. They're not as independent yet. And these kids also had parents who were essential workers, meaning their parents were likely out of the home because they needed to go to work every day to do the jobs that our state needed. And so the parents weren't able to be there, understandably, to potentially offer help with that instruction. So this indicates to us that access to remote instruction was not equitably distributed across our state. And we're looking forward to more data to sort of understand how specifically how that played out this last year. We also know, acknowledging this, that a lot of school districts mobilized to improve internet access and Wi-Fi device access in the spring and fall of 2020. So on this slide, you're going to see these are results from a survey that was administered by the Department of Education and the Colorado Education Initiative, where they asked districts, and many of them participated, about internet access for students. And what we saw is that among the districts that responded, going from spring 2020 to fall 2020, in all types of districts, non-rural, rural, and small rural, we saw improvements in how many kids or the share of kids had internet access. On this chart, the largest improvement was in our non-rural districts. They cut that figure of 7.4% of kids without internet down to 2.9%. But we still saw sort of improvements in all areas. When we look at Wi-Fi enabled devices, the improvements were larger. So between spring and fall 2020, again, we saw each type of district, non-rural, small rural, and rural, all cut their share of kids without devices about in half or more, which was huge progress for all types of districts. At the same time, I want to draw your attention to the percentages on the right of each of these charts. It represents the groups of kids that still were not reached during this time period. So while a huge effort went out to make sure that more kids were connected, there was still a large group of students in different types of districts who were locked out of classrooms, and we want to understand how that impacts their academic progress and their growth throughout that year. We have some early CMAS results that indicate how access may have, had impacts on academic proficiency. So as a reminder, the 2021 assessments were administered on a limited basis. The 2020 assessments were canceled. So what we have is 2019, a full suite of assessments with all grades, and 2021, a really limited view with lower participation rates. Of students who were able to test in 2021, the English language arts assessments were given to those in grades 3, 5, and 7, and the math assessments were given to students in grades 4, 6, and 8. So what you see in the red on this chart, this is the share of students who met or exceeded expectations on these specific assessments in 2019. And here is the performance in 2021. So we see some declines across the board across grade levels and subject areas. The larger performance declines were seen on the math assessments on the right-hand side of this chart. All 4, 6, and 8th grade math all saw large losses in the share of students who are meeting or exceeding expectations. 8th grade saw the biggest loss, going from 36.9 to just 29.5% of kids. But 6th grade, while not seeing the biggest drop, they had the lowest share of kids at the end of the year scoring in this range or scoring proficiently. So they only saw about 24.1% of kids in Math 6 who were meeting or exceeding expectations. The results also hint at the most negative impacts from the pandemic school year in terms of CMAS proficiency, hitting Hispanic Latino students who identify as English language learners, and students from low-income households who qualify for free or reduced price lunch. We saw some of the strongest negative impacts on the scores of those kids. And so again, in this section, we don't have all of the data we would love to have, but we do have clues around who had access, what all children experienced in the pandemic school year, and also who was hit the hardest by access issues and who struggled, in terms of academic proficiency. And this doesn't even begin to address, we know that schools are not only centers of academic proficiency, They're also centers for child health and well-being and social connections. It doesn't even begin to address those other pieces, which we talk a little bit more about in the report, that students may have gone without in this school year. So finally, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Perez Carrillo. She's our manager of policy and partnerships at the Children's Campaign to talk through a couple strategies for improving K-12 education.
Thanks, Erica. As you can imagine, when we think about K-12 education, we are considering both long and short-term strategies to think about the road to recovery as it relates to K-12 education. And with that, there are a few strategies that we think would help that path to recovery. First, exploring alternative indicators of student poverty and ensuring a more accurate, comprehensive count of students experiencing economic disadvantage. Colorado's school funding formula must account for and respond to students' economic circumstances in a better way. Ideally, a revised at-risk factor in the school finance formula would take into account dimensions of economic security beyond family income. Secondly, target dollars received through various federal stimulus packages to address differential access to the opportunities and resources students need to thrive. Over the next 3 years, $2.5 billion in federal stimulus should be used to drive significant change in our education system. This includes investments in evidence-based programs that address unfinished instruction and accelerate learning, and investments to address disparities in access to strong, diverse, and supported educators. Thirdly, create safe, healthy, and inclusive learning environments by focusing on measures of school climate. Colorado must provide guidance and support to schools and districts to support student academic, social, and emotional recovery from the pandemic. A shared definition of school climate and the use of school climate surveys represent important first steps in our understanding of school climate. Next, invest in robust statewide data infrastructure to collect and connect disaggregated data on measures of resource equity and student outcomes, and ensure learnings from RISE and other stimulus dollars are captured and utilized. Lastly, investing in a statewide student information system. A statewide student information system has the potential to reduce administrative burden felt by districts, to promote data transparency, quality, and security between districts and the CDE, and establish a more standardized, functional, and equitable operating platform. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Stephanie. Finally, as we finish out our presentation for today, just a quick reminder on county data pages. These are available every year in our report, and they're there this year as well. We look at each of Colorado's 64 counties and do a deep dive into county-specific data and across 40 indicators of child well-being. And then we compare that back to the state's data. So a lot of people love to look at these sheets to understand how their county is doing, and also in comparison to other counties as well. We have more county level data available on our Kids Count Data Center, which you see the link to up there. So if there's an indicator that you don't see on here that you're curious about, you're welcome to visit the data center or email myself or Sarah Hughes around looking at that data and understanding how your county is doing. And with that, we're going to jump to the Q&A, but just a sort of a final note on the report. Again, you know, a lot of the outcomes that we are seeing are hard to look at because we know that families and children have been hurt during this time significantly. And at the same time, we are very hopeful and very excited to work with many of the people who are here today to make our state better for children. And we believe that this has shined a light on a lot of those opportunities as we move forward. So I believe I'm actually turning it over to Riley Kitts. He's our Government Affairs Director, to run the Q&A section. And you're welcome to ask questions about the data, but you're also welcome to ask questions about the policy strategies. We'll make sure the right person is answering for you. So Riley, come on down.
Thank you, Erica. Nice job, and nice job, everybody. Hi, everyone. My name is Riley Kitts. I'm with the Children's Campaign, a Government Affairs Director. We did just have a few questions in the chat around a few specific things. One from Bethany. Thank you for asking around the question around teen suicide, the spike in 2014. I've been messaging with some of our team members. We are looking into some of that information. I believe in a prior Kids Count edition, we did go into some historical background around that. So we'll be sure to follow up with that. And then Senator Hudak, I did see your question about CMAS by grade. And yes, we do recognize that every child is unique. and is in their own individual. And we always do try to break down information and data and disaggregate it as best we can. And we can be sure to follow up with you if you have any other questions about that as well. But wanted to open up now. If there are any other questions for folks who wanted to drop it in the chat, or if you want to use the raise hand function, I think that would be helpful to help moderate. But if there are any questions, we would be happy to try our best to answer those today. Well, Erica and team, I think you maybe covered it all. Of course, I believe we're always happy to answer any follow-up questions. A lot of information to digest right now. Okay, we do have one question in the chat around, okay, we have a few more coming in, around the child tax credit, and maybe Sarah Barnes, you could help out with this one. But I think the question is here is on the expended child tax credit at the federal level. The impact, what would be if it were passed in the upcoming federal stimulus? Do you have any information around how much that's projected to help kids nationally or even in our state?
Yeah, it's a great question. We know that nationally, the expansion of the federal child tax credit has cut the child poverty rate nearly in half. So it's made a huge impact on child poverty. And that's why it's so important that we can find a way to extend or make permanent that expansion of the child tax credit at the federal level. And also importantly, we finally were able to fund our state's child tax credit at the end of this last legislative session, which was a huge win that advocates have been working towards since, I believe, 2013 in Colorado. And so for that reason as well, it's really important that we continue to invest in that really important tool to fight child poverty. So thanks for that question.
I'll also jump in, Riley, to respond to Senator Hudak. I know I see the point that you're making. I think it's just two different types of comparisons. So the comparison you're referencing is a growth comparison. We do look at growth scores. Unfortunately, this year, we haven't seen state level growth scores released by the Department of Education. So to look at fourth graders in 2019 and then how they did as sixth graders in 2021 is one way of understanding how the same kids did over time. But our general standard practice for the Kids Count report is to look at the grade level as the cohort changes. So we look at fifth grade over the years, acknowledging they are different kids testing each year, to understand just one piece, which is how was the content delivered, or what was the impact of the teaching of that content, and not necessarily follow the kids. Though we do work in growth, and we look at following the kids to understand how they're expected to achieve as they go through the K-12 system. So just this is our standard practice around comparing at the grade level across years, acknowledging their different cohorts of kids. But it is interesting to look at growth, and we're hoping that the Colorado Department of Education will put out some sort of statewide growth results or something that we can understand in terms of how kids did in their own cohorts year over year.
Erica, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for taking that question. We have allocated just a couple more minutes for some Q&A. So want to just leave it open for a little bit to see if anyone else had questions they want to drop in the chat or want to put into the room. Representative Duran, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I don't have a question. I just really have a comment, and I just want to say thank you so much for not only hosting the meeting, but I think this update is so important to have, because we've all been wondering, right, the impacts of the pandemic and how this has affected our children and our families. So I really appreciate all this information. It's really helpful moving forward, I think, to determine the policy that we need to focus on and work on next session. My question is, are you able to share this slide deck with us?
Yes, we will be sharing the recording and the PDF of the slide deck with everybody who registered for the webinar.
Great, thank you so much. It's really helpful to reference back to this information.
Thank you very much, Rep. Duran. We really appreciate those kind words. Erica, I'll probably hand it back over to you to close this out, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a big thank you again for all of you being here today. This report is the product of the work of a lot of people who collect data and make it possible for us to look at these changes. So at our different state agencies, a lot of families and individuals who respond to surveys who are willing to talk about their experiences, a lot of our staff at the Children's Campaign who you may or may not have seen today, who weigh in on how we're talking about this, and our communications team as well, who helps us write about all of this. And so this is a product that is a huge lift every year, but one we see as so important to give us a perspective around how kids and families are doing in a holistic view. And we just thank you so much for your commitment to the campaign and to the report. And we're really excited to share it all with you. So thank you again. And please, if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me or Sarah Hughes. I'm Erica at coloradokids.org, and Sarah is Sarah at coloradokids.org. So we look forward to those. Thank you so much.